هادي له ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله وصلى الله تبارك وتعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Now for the past few weeks we've been touching on the topic of imitation with the disbelievers, and last week I quoted 4 principles which was laid down by Mufti Taqi Usmani in his Taqrir al-Tirmidhi to determine whether a piece of garment, whether a particular brand or type of clothing is permissible to wear or not. And under that topic we went on to look at whether it is permissible for Muslims to sit on chairs and eat on tables, and whether it is permissible for Muslims to eat with knife and fork. So these issues were looked at and were touched on last week. Now in this week's lesson, in this week's dars, firstly we're going to be looking at hairstyles and haircuts, and we will also be looking at whether it is permissible for Muslim women to cut their hair. And then after we conclude that particular topic, we'll be looking at the issue of Ameen, because that's after you recite Ghayril Maghdubi alayhim waladdallin in Salah, then there is a masla regarding Ameen, that whether you will say loudly, whether you say quietly, and inshallah that will conclude Surah Al-Fatiha, then inshallah we'll make a start on Surah Al-Baqarah. Now, the first issue which we are going to look at today is regarding hairstyles. Nowadays many Muslim youth have short back and sides, they have step cuts. Now the question is that whether such hairstyles are permissible for a Muslim to have or not. Now, last week or the week before, I mentioned that a sign of a true believer, a sign of a Muslim, is that he loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he loves Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And a person who claims to love Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he has to show it in his appearance. The way Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talked, the way Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam walked, his conduct, his habit, his appearance. Such a person should try to imitate the appearance of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he should shun the appearance of the disbelievers and the kuffar. Now there are many ahadith which describe the hairstyle and the haircut and the length of hair which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had. There is a hadith of Sahih al-Muslim which says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hair was unto his earlobes, or it was to his earlobes. Shahmata udunayhi, that's the word which is mentioned in the hadith, that it was to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's earlobes. And there are other hadiths which describes that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hair was all the way to his shoulders. Mankabayhi, the word is. And there are many other hadiths which describe that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would look after his hair, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would oil his hair, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would put gel in his hair. This gel, not the haram or the unlawful kind of gel we have nowadays, which have unlawful ingredients, but there was a gel during Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time which was called talbib, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would apply this gel whilst in the state of ihram. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had long hair, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had hair, and on top of that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would take care of keeping his appearance neat, and would take care that his hair was regularly combed, was regularly oiled and gelled. Now the common denominator from all the hadiths is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hair all the time was even. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, sometimes his hair was up to his earlobes, sometimes it was up to his shoulders. But all the time, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had even hair. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never ever had uneven hair. Furthermore, there is a hadith of Sunan Nasai and Sunan Abu Dawud, where once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw this boy, and part of his head had been shaved and part of it was left. That some part of his head was shaved and some of it was left. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he calls this boy and he orders the boy that don't do this. Either shave your head or keep the hair. Either shave all of it off or leave all of it. So again, from this particular hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is stressing on the importance of having even hair. That you're not allowed to have some parts of your head where there's hair and the other part where it's bald. You have to have even hair. Whether you trim all of it, whether you shave all of it, have a zero number, or whether you keep hair and keep it even. Now, keeping the information or the aforementioned information in mind, we can deduce that short back and side, step cut, or any other cuts where the hair is uneven. You may be, for example, the top may be blade 4 and the side may be blade 3. Again, that would not be allowed, that would not be permissible. Why? Because it is uneven hair. So the main masla which I'm trying to deduce from here is that it is necessary for Muslims to keep even hair. Any uneven hair, whether it is through a short back and side, or whether it is a step cut, or whether you're blending your hair, if you have uneven hair, then that is something which is not allowed and something which is not permitted in Islam. And if a person does it, or has a step cut, or has a short back and side, to imitate the kuffar, if he's doing it with imitating the disbelievers, and as I mentioned before many weeks ago, that will be something which will be impermissible and something not allowed. So that is the first ruling. And the second ruling, very quickly, is regarding whether it is permissible for Muslim women to cut their hair. Now, a great Hanafi scholar in the name of Mufti Abdul Rahim Lajpuri Rahmatullah Alayh was written a book called Fatah Rahimiyya. In Fatah Rahimiyya, Mufti Abdul Rahim Lajpuri Rahmatullah Alayh, he quotes from Ruhul Bayan, a saying that Subhana man zayyana rijal bil luha wa zayyana nisa bil zawaid, that the angels in the sky, they praise those men who adorn themselves with the beard, and they praise those women who adorn themselves with long hair. So this is a quote, not exactly a hadith, but the meaning of the quote is that the angels in the sky, they praise those people who have beard, and they praise those women who have long hair. So from this particular quote, we can deduce and understand that keeping long hair is a sign of beauty for a Muslim woman. That's the same way a beard is a sign of beauty, then similarly a woman who has a long hair, then that is a sign of beauty for her. Imagine a woman having a bald or shaving all her hair, how unattractive she will look. So similarly, the long hair or long hair for a woman, for a Muslim woman, is considered as a sign of beauty. Allama Ibn Abidin al-Shami Rahmatullah Alayhi was written a book called Raddul Mukhtar, a very famous book in Hanafi jurisprudence. He has written that if a woman cuts her hair, then utimat wa lu'inat, i.e. she will be sinful for her actions, and on top of that she will be cursed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is mentioned in Fatah Bazzaziyah, وَإِن بِإِذْنِ الزَّوْجِ لِأَنَّهُ لَا طَاعَةَ لِمَخْلُوقٍ فِي مَعْصِيَةِ الْخَالِقِ, that even though the husband may have ordered her, even though the husband may have forced his wife to cut her hair, to shave her hair, even though it may have been done with the consent or the permission of the husband, even then that woman, if she was to cut her hair, she will be considered sinful, and the wrath and the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be upon her. Why? Because of the hadith, لِأَنَّهُ لَا طَاعَةَ لِمَخْلُوقٍ فِي مَعْصِيَةِ الْخَالِقِ, that there is no obedience in the creation, in the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. the creator. Now there are many books which have been written regarding the impermissibility of Muslim women cutting their hair. And even if you go onto websites on the internet, you will find many hadiths which indicate towards the impermissibility of Muslim women cutting their hair. And the common hadith, or the most commonly used hadith which will be used to show the impermissibility of Muslim women cutting their hair, will be a hadith of Sunan al-Nasai, where it's narrated by Sayyiduna Ali radhiyallahu anhu that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam an tahdika al-mar'atu ra'saha, that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has prohibited women from shaving their hair. An tahdika al-mar'atu ra'saha. The word halaq here means shaving. Now, the view of my respected teacher, Hazrat Sufi Tahir Sahib, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give barakah and blessings in his ilm and preserve him, he says that to establish the impermissibility of women cutting their hair from this particular hadith is incorrect. Now the reason why he says it's incorrect is because the wording of the hadith is tahlika, which means shaving. And those scholars who say that Muslim women can cut their hair, those women who cut their hair, they reply to this hadith and they say that, look, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used the word shaving. So we're not shaving our hair, we're just cutting a few strands here and there, so therefore it should be permissible. So because of this reason, Hazrat Sufi Tahir Sahib says that it's not correct to establish the impermissibility of Muslim women cutting their hair from this particular hadith. Instead, he mentioned another hadith which can be found in Tabrani, in which the great Imam Tabrani rahmatullahi alayhi has said, وَرِجَالُهُ ثِقَاتٌ, i.e. the narrators of this particular hadith are all reliable. And the word of the hadith is that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has said, Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam anil jummati lin nisa, that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has prohibited women from doing Jummah. Now what does Jummah mean? Jummah means hair up to your shoulders. That is meant by Jummah. Hair up to your shoulders. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is prohibiting women from doing Jummah, it means that it is impermissible for women to cut their hair above their shoulders. Meaning that up to their shoulders, then that would be allowed, but above that, then that would be haram and that would be impermissible. Now the next mas'ala we're going to look at with regards to women cutting their hair is to what extent can the women cut their hair? Because sometimes a woman or some women, they grow so much hair that it is difficult for them to sit down. It is difficult for them to do anything. Like for example, if it's so much that it's below their backside, below their bottom, or if it's reaching all the way to their feet, then it's difficult for them to because obviously they're not all the time can tie their hair. Sometimes they may need to let it loose and so on. So if they have too much hair, then it's going to be difficult for them to do their daily chores at home. So the masla or the ruling is in the Hanafi fiqh is that if a woman has a lot of hair, then she can cut it up to her bottom. So just say for example she's got hair which is up to her bottom, then she can cut it up to there. So if it's longer than her bottom, then she can cut it all the way up to her bottom. Anything above that, then that is not allowed in the Hanafi fiqh. Now the reason why it's not allowed in the Hanafi fiqh is because you need to realize this is a principle in fiqh and in Islam, is something which is haram. Anything which leads to haram will also be haram. Like a good example of that will be like boyfriend, girlfriend. Now obviously everybody knows adultery, zina is haram. So having a girlfriend or having a boyfriend, that will also be haram as well. Even though you may be thinking, oh, I'm just chatting to her, I'm not doing anything naughty with her or anything, but even then that will also be haram as well. Why? Because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. It could be that the beginning you're just texting her, then the next thing you know you're just emailing her, next thing you know you're just phoning her, the next thing you know something bad has happened. So anything which leads to haram will also be haram as well. Now what do the Hanafi scholars say regarding cutting their hair? They say that look, strictly speaking, because I mentioned the hadith, women, it is haram for them to cut their hair above their shoulders. So anything below their shoulders, like if they have hair onto their back, so they could cut it all the way into their shoulders. But even then that is not allowed. Why? Because if they start cutting their hair, bit and bit, then what will happen eventually is that they will just keep on cutting it all the way. The next thing you know that they will have hair up to their earlobes, and that is something which is not allowed in Islam. It's like my teachers would say when we were growing up that, don't even touch your beard. Obviously I'm going to mention this later on that, the hair which is on the cheek, you can trim it, you can shave it. But my teacher used to say that, no, don't even touch that, because what will happen is that if you start touching this, the next thing you know you start touching the beard, and then next thing you know that you'll be shaving your beard and trimming your beard, and when it becomes a habit, then you can't get out of it. So exactly same thing with regards to women cutting their hair, that we say that, okay, the most they can cut to is up to their backside, but anything above that, that would not be allowed, because if they start cutting it, the next thing you know is that they will start cutting it above their shoulders and up to their earlobes, and that is something which is not allowed and something which is haram in Islam. So, alhamdulillah, that concludes the issue regarding imitation with the disbelievers. The next thing we're going to look at very briefly is the issue of Ameen. Now, when the Imam in Salah, when he recites غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, then everyone, including the Imam and the Muqtadis, the followers, they should recite or they should say Ameen. And there are many virtues regarding or with regards to saying Ameen. There is a very famous hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari where the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that when the Imam says غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ فَقُولُوا آمين, then say Ameen. Because the angels say Ameen as well. And whichever person's Ameen coincides with the Ameen said by the angels, all their previous sins will be forgiven. Meaning that when the Imam says غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, say Ameen. And if at that time you're one of the lucky ones, the angels had said Ameen as well, then all the previous sins you've done, they will all be forgiven. Now it is a unanimous view, like all the scholars unanimously agree, that to say Ameen is something which is Sunnah. When the Imam says غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, then to say Ameen is a Sunnah. However, the difference of opinion is with regards to how to say the Ameen. Meaning that should you say the Ameen loudly or should you say the Ameen quietly? That when the Imam says غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ in Fajr and in Maghrib and in Isha Salah, in loud Salah, then should you say the Ameen quietly, you can just hear yourself, or should we say it loudly or to such an extent that the person next to you can hear you? Now, the fact of the matter is that there are two types of ahadith. There are some ahadith which indicate that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the Ameen loudly. And there are some ahadith which indicates or which shows that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the Ameen quietly. So there are two types of hadith. And the difference of opinion is something which in Arabic is known as afzaliyat or ghair afzaliyat, meaning that which one is better of the two. It's not something where it's got to do with halal and haram. The difference of opinion amongst the ulamas, amongst the scholars, whether you should say the Ameen loudly or quietly, it's got to do with which is better, that which is more virtuous and so on. And Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh, he actually mentions, Ibn Qayyim, a great scholar, he actually mentions that there should be no criticism aimed at the other group. Meaning, like just say if a group or if a group of people, they say Ameen loudly after Salah, then they shouldn't criticize those people who say Ameen quietly. Similarly, those people or those groups who say Ameen quietly after Walad Dwali, then they shouldn't criticize those people who say Ameen loudly. Now, it's a sad indictment of our community, and it kind of shows the lack of knowledge which people have, that if a group of people, if they're saying Ameen loudly, then those who say it quietly, then they start accusing them, they start telling them, oh, you don't know any, you're ignorant, you don't have any knowledge about hadith, they start accusing them of being astray and so on. This is something which is wrong. Those people who do those kind of things, who kind of want to do ikhtilaf and cause disagreement and differences, then that shows them how ignorant they are. That shows them the lack of knowledge they have. Because those who have knowledge will know that this is such an issue, this is a trivial issue. There's no need for like scholars to even like talk about it. No, I could have, instead of touching on this topic, I could have started Surah Al-Baqarah. But because the community we're living in is such that there are like different factions, there are different groups, then they like to cause problems regarding these kind of issues. So therefore it is important like for scholars and people to write books or even people to mention it so people know the true hakikat and the true essence of this particular issue and ruling. So as I was mentioning that this is an issue which has got to do with something which is better and something which is preferable, what is the most virtuous act to do, whether it is to say whether it is to say Ameen loudly or whether it is to say quietly. That's what it is. It's got nothing to do with something about belief. It's got nothing to do about aqidah, that if you say Ameen loudly, then that means that you've become a kafir, you've become a disbeliever, or if you say Ameen quietly, it doesn't mean that you've become a disbeliever and so on. It's got nothing to do with belief, but it's something about what is preferable and what is more virtuous to do. So because of that reason, I'll just mention some things regarding this particular issue. Now, there's a couple of rulings here. The first ruling is that it is sunnah for both the imam and the muqtadi to say Bismillah, to say Amin. That when the imam reads the Ghayril Maghdubi alayhim waladdallin, then the imam as well and also the muqtadi, they should say Amin. Now the next issue is regarding the sound. That when the imam says Ghayril Maghdubi alayhim waladdallin, should you say loudly or quiet? Now according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, Imam Malik rahmatullah alayh, and the latter view, which is known as Qawl al-Jadid of Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayh, is that Ameen should be said silently and it should be said quietly. Now when the Imam says Ghayril Maghdubi alayhim waladdallin, then in the Hanafi fiqh, the latter view of Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayh, and in the fiqh of Imam Malik rahmatullah alayh, the Ameen should be said quietly and silently. Whereas Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayh's earlier view, upon which the Shafi school of thought has given fatwa upon, and the view of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayh, that is that Ameen should be said loudly. So when the Imam says Ghayril Maghdubi alayhim waladdallin, then the muqtadi and the Imam, they should say the Ameen loudly. Now I'm going to first of all begin with proofs from the Hanafi school of thought to show that to say Ameen, or one should say Ameen quietly and silently. Now firstly, Hafiz bin Hajar rahmatullah alayh, in his thesis of Sahih al-Bukhari, which is a commentary of Sahih al-Bukhari, he says that Ameen is a dua. The Ameen, when you say Ghayril Maghdubi alayhim waladdallin, then to say Ameen, it's like a dua, it's like a supplication. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran, in many, many places, has taught us the art and the etiquette of asking Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Udu'u rabbakum tadarru'an wa khufiyya. That pray or invoke to your Lord, tadarru'an, i.e. through humility or out of humbleness, wa khufiyya, and silently and quietly. So from this particular verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us how to do dua. And that is that when you make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you raise your hands in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you should try and make yourself humble, and you should do it quietly, you should do it discreetly. On top of that, in Surah Maryam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He relates the story of Sayyidina Zakaria alayhi salam, the Prophet Zakaria alayhi salam, when Zakaria alayhi salam prays to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the words are, إِذْ نَادَى رَبَّهُ نِدَاءً خَفِيًّا. That when Sayyidina Zakaria alayhi salam called to his Lord, then he called him nida'an khafiyya, discreetly. So the first thing we can establish and prove is Ameen is a dua. And duas should be done discreetly, it should be done quietly, it should be done silently. So therefore, when the Imam says Ghayril Maghdubi alayhim waladdallin, then one should say the Ameen quietly and discreetly. So that is one evidence and one proof. The second evidence, or the second proof, is that there are many ahadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, still doing the first one with regards to doing dua discreetly, is that there are many ahadith where the companions, when they would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or when they would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would do the dua in a loud voice. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam prohibited the companions from doing that, and he said to the companions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qareeb, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is close, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sami', meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can hear everything. So therefore, when you do dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then do dua or invoke Him discreetly and quietly. So that is evidence number 2. Proof number 3, or evidence number 3, is a hadith which can be found in Sunan Abu Dawud. Now the wording of the hadith is that there were two companions, very famous companions, in the name of Samura bin Jundub radhiyallahu anhu and Imran bin Hussein radhiyallahu anhu. Now after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, these two companions, they were talking about the salah, how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would do his namaz and so on. So Samura bin Jundub radhiyallahu anhu, he says to Imran bin Hussein radhiyallahu anhu that in Salah, in the first rakat, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be silent, or he would be quiet in two places. Meaning that in two places, in the first rakat, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be quiet. And Samura bin Jundub radhiyallahu anhu says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be quiet after the initial takbir. Meaning that after takbir tahrima, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be quiet. And the reason why he would be quiet, as you know, that after takbir tahrima you read Subhanakallahumma sana, and as all of you know, sana should be recited quiet. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be quiet then. And the second time when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be quiet during the first rakat is when he used to recite wala dwalin, then he would be quiet. So from this particular hadith, we can deduce and prove that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say or would have said the Ameen quiet. Because if it was said loudly, then Samura bin Jundub radhiyallahu anhu would have narrated that, would have related that in the hadith. But what Samura bin Jundub radhiyallahu anhu says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was quiet. And the fourth proof, which is more clear, is a hadith of Tirmidhi, Sunan Tirmidhi, where it's narrated by Wa'il bin Hujr radhiyallahu anhu. He narrates that when the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would read Salah, he would read غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ وَقَالَ آمين. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say Ameen, وَخَفَضَ بِهَا صَوْتَهُ, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would subdue the Ameen, i.e. he would say the Ameen quietly. The Arabic is وَخَفَضَ خَفَضَ بِهَا صَوْتَهُ, i.e. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would subdue and would say the Ameen quietly. So that is proof or evidence number 4. Evidence number 5 is a hadith which can be found in Musnad Ahmad, Mustadrak al-Hakim, and in Dar Qutni, where Shu'bah, a tabi in the name of Shu'bah, he reports from Alqamah, who narrates from his father that his father performed salah, or his father performed namaz with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam reached غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said Ameen, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam kept his voice subdued, i.e. kept his voice quiet. So these are 5 proofs, 5 evidences which shows that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam recited Ameen, but he did it quietly. Obviously there are also other hadiths as well which say that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the Ameen loudly, which inshallah we'll come back to that later. Now whenever there is a difference of opinion, like this is kind of a principle in fiqh, that if there are contradicting views in a hadith, say, let's say one hadith is saying that this is allowed, one hadith is saying this is haram, or you got another hadith, like for example here, which says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said Ameen loudly, and other hadith is saying that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the Ameen quietly, then the next thing we do is that we look at the sayings of the companions and the sayings of the tabi'in, the predecessors. And when we look through the actions of, in particular, Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radhiyallahu anhu, the second Khalifa of Islam, and Sayyidina Ali radhiyallahu anhu, the fourth Khalifa of Islam, and other great esteemed Sahaba such as Sayyidina Abdullah bin Masud radhiyallahu anhu, he has mentioned that these 3 prominent Sahabas, they did the following 3 things, or said the following 3 things quietly. What are the following 3 things? Number 1, ta'awuz, auzu billah. That in salah, when you start your salah, then to say auzu billah minash shaitanir rajim. Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radhiyallahu anhu, Sayyidina Ali, Sayyidina Abdullah bin Mas'ud radhiyallahu anhu would say it quietly. Number 2, the bismillah, the tasmiyah. They would say that quietly. And the third thing which they used to say quietly was the Ameen. That when the Imam used to recite wala dwalin, then they would say the Ameen, but they would say it quietly, and this is the practice of great Sahaba such as Umar bin Khattab radhiyallahu anhu, Sayyidina Ali radhiyallahu anhu, Sayyidina Abdullah bin Masud radhiyallahu anhu. Now the hadith which appear to be contradictory, i.e. those hadiths which say that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the Ameen loudly, there are quite a few of them. But just a couple which I'm just going to mention, which is normally used to prove the other party or the other group's point, is a hadith which is found in Sunan Tirmidhi, Now the words of the hadith are similar to the hadith which I mentioned before, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would recite غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ وَقَالَ آمِينَ, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say Ameen. Now the hadith which I mentioned before, the Arabic was وَخَفَضَ بِهَا صَوْتًا, but in this particular tradition or narration, it's got the word وَمَدَّ بِهَا صَوْتًا. And madda, those of you who know Arabic will know, madda means stretch, i.e. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would stretch the Ameen. Now the reply from the Hanafi school of thought on this particular hadith is, here madda means stretch, and what we say is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't say the Ameen loudly, but you know the khara zabar on the alif, he only stretched that, i.e. he said Ameen. So this does not necessarily mean that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the Ameen loud. So that is our reply on that particular hadith. And the second hadith, which is brought forward to show that Ameen should be said loudly, is a hadith narrated by Sayyidina Abu Hurairah anhu, and the hadith can be found in Sunan Abu Dawud and Sunan Ibn Majah, where it said that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he recited Walad Dwalleen, then he would say Ameen, and the sound of the Ameen can be heard from the first row, i.e. from the first row, the sound of the Ameen can be heard, indicating that the Ameen must have been said loudly. Because of that reason, the whole mosque would probably have echoed, or probably the whole mosque may have echoed the sound of Ameen, or because of that reason, because it was said so loudly that the Sahabas who may have been on the last saf, they heard the Ameen being echoed from the first row. Now with regards to this particular hadith, our reply, i.e. the reply from the Hanafi school of thought, is that there is a narrator of this hadith whose name is Bishr bin Rafi'. Bishr bin Rafi' radiallahu anhu. And all these scholars of hadith, such as Imam Bukhari rahmatullah alayh, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayh, Imam Nasai rahmatullah alayh, and so on, they have all said that Bishr bin Rafi' is a weak narrator. He is something known as da'if. He is a weak narrator. And some have even gone on to say that he is wadda'ul hadith, meaning that he is a fabricator, that he fabricates hadiths. That was his profession, that he would actually fabricate hadiths, make up hadiths. So because of this reason, the hadith which can be found in Sunan Abu Dawud and Sunan Ibn Majah is considered as a weak hadith, and therefore it will not be accepted by the scholars, by the ulamas, and so on. Now the conclusion of this particular topic, whether you will say the Ameen loudly or whether you will say quietly, is that the Hanafi school of thought, the Hanafi scholars, we do not reject Ameen being said loudly. We also say that Ameen was said loudly. But what we say is that Ameen, or those occasions where Ameen was said loudly, it was done temporarily. That it wasn't the common practice of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that when Qaydin Maghdubi alayhim walad Dwalleen is recited and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say Ameen. This wasn't the common practice of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it was done arzi thought, but it was done temporarily. And Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi, he kind of concludes the whole discussion, and he says that there are so many occasions where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions would sometimes read a dua or a supplication loudly to teach and to educate the fellow Muslims, or to educate the companions. Like for example, he quotes Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab anhu, that there were some occasions where in the first rakat of Salah, when Allahu Akbar Takbir Tahlima was done, then Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab anhu would say the sana, ay subhanakallahumma bihamdika, loudly, even though it is a consensus for all the scholars that the sana should be done quietly. But sometimes Umar bin Khattab anhu would have done or would have said the sana loudly. Why? To educate the people regarding the importance of saying sana after you start your salah. So exactly same thing we say regarding Ameen, that it is preferable to say the Ameen quietly, silently. However, those ahadith or those occasions when it says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the Ameen loudly, our reply to that was that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did it temporarily to teach and to educate the fellow Sahabas and companions of the importance of Ameen. And what is the importance of Ameen? As I mentioned the hadith, that whoever says Ameen and his Ameen coincides with the Ameen of the angels, then all his previous sins will be forgiven. Then inshallah we'll just leave it here for this week. Inshallah next week we'll start Surah Al-Baqarah. اللهم أنت السلام ومنك السلام تبارك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام اللهم آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا وعملا متقبلا ورزقا طيبا وشفاء من كل داء وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك. Just an announcement is regarding the Stick-Off Marriage course. You want to give it up? So inshallah it's going to start next Saturday at 4 o'clock. It's after the Tafseer class around 4ish. Inshallah it will start. So if anybody's interested then inshallah please come on. Does anyone have any questions?
You know, for boys, for these fibers, you have slits in the eyes.
Yeah, it'll be impermissible, isn't it?
There's a couple of boys got a couple of slits in the eyes.
No, you will not be allowed. You're not supposed to trim your. Allowed to do that.
Yeah. For the question, you mentioned the verse of the Quran, Nidan Tafseer, said by Zakaria to Allah Ta'ala. And the other place you mentioned, every morning, Mandil, say you need to ask Allah Ta'ala in a good manner. But I'm looking at the Surah Maryam, he's challenging Allah Ta'ala, and Allah Ta'ala likes him, killing, grant him son. And what's the difference between these, the difference for that? Nidar Safiya and Udura Pakaduru Mafia.
What's the difference?
Allah Ta'ala say you asked me with humbleness, another place he's challenging Allah Ta'ala.
Challenging.
Yeah, he said, he asked Allah Ta'ala Nidar Safiya, that he was old, he was 90 years old, and he Maryam. And
it wasn't a challenge. Well, if you look at the particular tafsir of that particular verse, it wasn't setting a challenge. It was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him a child to show his greatness. It wasn't a challenge.
But he said I'm 100 years old and my beard.
No, that wasn't said as a challenge. That was said sometimes when you're ajis. When you're ajis and so on, then when you say those kind of words, it wasn't said in a challenge. Yeah. Because obviously, generally, when you do make dua, you should say in a humble way. It wasn't said in a challenge.